Hello everyone, I am back with another video. Today, sharing my top 10 games of 2023. Finally, I was a little bit more delayed in getting this video out than I wanted to be, just because towards the tail end of the year I got sick, and so I couldn't really meet my newer tradition of sharing my top 10 games to ring in the new year. But here we are in 2024. I still wanted to make sure I got this video out because 2023 was such a strong year for games, one of the best in recent memory for me, and it just really covered the entire spectrum, from AAA to indie, really everything in between. So I hope my list is a reflection of just how strong a year it was, while still staying true to, of course, the types of games that I love to play. I think there were a few surprises in there that I think should be interesting for all of you tuning in to this video, but as always, I hope the video finds you well here in the new year. I'm, of course, sipping on a piping hot cup of coffee. Hopefully you're doing the same, maybe tea or the beverage of your choosing. We, of course, have Scooby here in the background. Maybe he'll chime in the video at one point or another. But first and foremost, before we get into my actual list, it's important to kind of lay down some ground rules. I always do this when I create these videos because you have to know this is my list, right? This is not your list or anyone else's list, IGN, GameSpot, or anything else. This is going to be very specific to me, so if you don't see a particular game on your list, like Hogwarts Legacy or Tears of the Kingdom, spoilers, they're not going to be here, among many others. But the other thing that's important to note is that most of the time, I don't play a tremendous amount of games that come out in the year of release. I typically chip away at my backlog. I'll pick up the games that really, cater to my interest, and usually 50 to 60% of my top 10 is in the year of release games, and then I typically have 3 to 5 games that had come out in a prior year. But 2023, because it was so strong, you're gonna find, I think, only one game, maybe two, that didn't come out in 2023 on my list. So a lot of representation from the year that was, and hopefully you'll come away from this video with a recommendation or two. So that's really the only rule I have for myself. I allow myself to have remasters and remakes and things of that nature. So with all that being said, why don't we go ahead and jump right into number 10. Now, no list for me is complete without some 3D platformer representation. If you've been following my channel or my podcast for any amount of time, you'll know that I am a big fan of 3D platformers, regardless of the quality. And I have to make sure I call out the quality of this one because there is a tremendous amount of jank, and it is rather unpolished. But that is a buddy 3D platformer that came out earlier this year called Clive and Wrench. This is a game I was following the development of for quite some time because the solo developer would post screenshots and videos of the game over the course of its development on Twitter. And so I pre-ordered the collector's edition. It arrived earlier in the year, and for the most part, it met my expectations. This is really meant to be a love letter to 3D platformers of the N64 and PS1 eras. So think Banjo-Kazooie, Spyro Ripto's Rage. You're going to be collecting a colossal ton of just stuff. There's 11 colorful worlds to explore, but again, I have to make sure I highlight the fact that this game has a lot of bugs, it has a lot of jank, but more often than not, that truly just added to the fun factor for me because I was legitimately laughing out loud at certain points because there was one level kind of set in ancient China where there was this dragon flying through the sky and it was moving around at like 2 frames per second. And there were so many other instances of things like that happening. Birds clipping into walls, other things moving at horrible frame rates. But if you like buddy 3D platformers of the N64 and PS1 era, you really owe it to yourself to pick this one up. It's not going to be for everyone. I wouldn't recommend getting it for full price, but if you're like me, where you are just constantly wanting to find more 3D platformers to play that aren't Mario and some of the more notable franchises out there, give Clive and Wrench a try, although I would play it on PlayStation because I can't imagine what that game looks and runs like on Switch. Now, coming in at number 9 is not a game that released in 2023, and it caught me by complete surprise just how much I actually enjoyed it, but requires a bit of a story because I pre-ordered this game several years ago before I even had a console to be able to play it on, and that is Halo Infinite. I went on BestBuy.com after they announced pre-orders were up. I got the special edition with this Master Chief figure, and my copy must have sat on that shelf for at least a year and a half, 2 years, because I wanted to make sure that 343 Studios delivered on their promise of bringing back couch co-op. And for a while, they were still planning to do that until they weren't, and they completely scrapped it. So, bit of a bummer, but my brother-in-law and I still were able to play co-op online. He came over to my house, we squatted up, 2 TVs side by side, just like the old school days back in the early 2000s with Halo 1 and Halo 2. And again, I just have to say, this game completely took me by surprise because normally Halo, you're going through corridors, shoot up a bunch of guys, and then move on to the next area. But this is the first Halo where they kind of took it to an open world. So I kind of went in with eyes wide open. I like open world games, but I didn't really know how that was going to translate to a first-person shooter, let alone Halo, a series that again has been known for kind of its tight corridors and going through level to level. And what I loved about this game is that it kind of plays like an Ubisoft open world game. I personally love the Far Cry series. I love Assassin's Creed. And I feel like 343 Studios kind of took a couple pages from those games' books and kind of introduces it into Halo Infinite, where you have these outposts set up on various areas of the map. You of course have your main story that you can go ahead and progress, but I would not encourage folks to do that. You know, get in a warthog, explore the world. You have to play this game with a friend though. I can't imagine playing this game solo because it really would feel a little bare bones, a little empty, a little uninspired. But when you're playing with a friend, you kind of begin to kind of make your own games, make your own fun, figure out where you're going to go next in the map. You plot that marker and then you kind of just go. But where things really kind of changed for me when it came to Halo Infinite was when they introduced the grappling hook. And you can basically just Spider-Man yourself around the map. There are mountains that you should not be able to climb, but thanks to your handy-dandy hook shot, you can just shoot yourself right up there. You can cross gaps in the level that you also shouldn't be able to cross, but we still found ways to kind of get to areas of the map that we probably shouldn't have been going quite yet because we hadn't progressed the story to a certain point. But what it really boils down to is Halo finally felt fun and fresh and new for the first time since probably Halo Reach, maybe even Halo 3. I never played 5, 4 was okay, but with Infinite kind of introducing the open world, the hook shot, among several other kind of gameplay mechanics, Halo just is finally fun to play again, especially with a friend. Even if we can't do it in the traditional sense with couch co-op, you can still play online and it's still a ton of fun. I haven't even touched the online, I've just been focused on the campaign, so I had to make sure that I highlighted it as part of my top 10 games of the year. Number 8 on my list is a little indie game that I was very much anticipating coming into the year, and that's Chia. It was a day-and-date PlayStation Plus release back in March, and my goodness, what a wholesome experience this game was. You play as this young girl exploring a collection of tropical islands that's based on a real-world place called New Caledonia. And the developers actually visited this place several times over the course of the development of the game to ensure that they were really bringing this world to life in Chia. And it certainly shows. While I've never been there, there's just so much detail and care and love that went into kind of creating this collection of islands that you get to explore as this young girl. Now, the main mechanic that you've probably seen in gameplay trailers is that there's a mechanic called soul jumping. And so this young girl can kind of jump into and take control of inanimate objects or animals across the island. So maybe you want to climb a mountain to get to your next quest or to collect an item. You can kind of soul jump into a seagull or some other bird, fly to the top of the island, get your little collectible, slingshot yourself off of a palm tree to get to the bottom of the island, and maybe you're walking along the coast, you see a dolphin or a sea turtle, you can soul jump into that animal as well. And so the game places a heavy emphasis on exploring this island as you take control of several different types of animals that, again, it's really up to you how you want to navigate the island. You can run around just as this young girl, but that's not very fun because you can, again, fly as a bird or swim the seas as a shark or dolphin. Now, I never thought the story was anything to write home about. I was much more caught up in exploring the island and collecting its many collectibles than I was in progressing the story in any meaningful way. But there's a decent story there that actually can be a bit darker than you anticipate in an indie game like this. But it's a tremendous amount of fun, very wholesome. If you've played stuff like A Short Hike, again, very easy on the mind, especially after playing something like Final Fantasy 16 and coming down from that experience. Chia was just a beautiful tropical world to kind of retreat to after the events of that game, and it is kind of Ubisoft open world in its design as well, not unlike Halo Infinite, where you kind of sync at various points in the game. Once you sync in Assassin's Creed-like fashion, a whole bunch of collectibles kind of pop up on the map, in addition to some side quest activities as well. So there's plenty of stuff to find, discover, and do in Chia. You can probably finish the main story in about 6 to 8 hours, but if you want to find and collect everything in the game, you're looking at 15 to 20 plus hours of content. So well worth the price of admission. Number 7 on my list is Theatrhythm Final Bar Line. This, of course, is the follow-up to the 3DS games of the same name, Theatrhythm and Curtain Call. Just a celebration of the Final Fantasy franchise and the music that really brings those games to life. I put about 40 hours in this game the first week I had it, and I haven't really gone back actually until the more recent weeks. But maybe what I love most about Final Bar Line is just there are so many Final Fantasy games that I have yet to play. But when you can kind of dip in and play a song or two of or from the games that you haven't played, it almost kind of feels like a blockbuster rental to see, is the music in this game good enough to warrant, starting, this 20 to 80 hour adventure. And it also gives me the opportunity to revisit some of my favorite Final Fantasy games like 9 to 13, play Over the Hill or Blinded by Light, and kind of scratch that itch of replaying the game without needing to spend 40 to 60 plus hours actually replaying it. So this game was the gift that keeps on giving. We got a tremendous amount of DLC that I've yet to even download. So very much looking forward to picking up the season passes here in the months to come, and then continuing to go back to Final Bar Line in the years to come, because it really is just such a comfort food game. It was my comfort food game over the course of 2023, and very much looking forward to playing it more going forward. Coming in at number 6 was a game I actually reviewed earlier in the year, another Final Fantasy game, and that is Final Fantasy XII, The Zodiac Age. This, of course, is the remaster of the original PS2 release, and I absolutely loved this game. And there are just a couple of things that I want to highlight without going into too much detail. I'd strongly encourage you watch my review because it's like 20 plus minutes long, and I just completely gush about the game for most of that time. But the thing that I love most about 12 was the combat system. Known as the Gambit system, a lot of people critique it because they feel it was too MMO and they didn't really like it a whole lot. I loved it. I thought it was so much fun, kind of getting into the menu system, configuring your party to do certain actions, kind of in response to circumstances that play out over the course of combat. And if you do a good enough job of configuring your gambits well enough early on in the game, the combat almost kind of has this hands-off feel to it, if that makes sense, and is just really conducive to long stretches of grinding. Whether you're running across a long desert, a forest, or just going through a dungeon, I loved grinding in this game, especially because there are a number of quality of life features in Zodiac Age, one of which is you being able to speed up the pace of which your characters are moving in combat to either ×2 or ×4 speed. Think of how you can adjust your podcast up to 1.5 or ×2 speed. You can do that in Zodiac Age with the combat. And so if your gambits are configured well enough, you can kind of just run through these environments, mash a bunch of bad guys, rack up the XP, go back to town, get your potions, get your Phoenix Downs, and then go into the next boss and just annihilate that person. So I loved that gameplay loop. I also absolutely adored the soundtrack, which was composed by Hitoshi Sakamoto. You might recognize his name because he composed Vagrant Story, Final Fantasy Tactics on the PlayStation 1, as well as a lot of other games over the past several years. But I also won't go into the story. Again, you can go to my review to hear more details about that. I did enjoy it quite a bit. It's not as convoluted and political as the internet might make it seem. I think this game gets far more hate than is actually deserving, whether it's the combat or the story, but I enjoyed it quite a bit. I actually had a whole bit in my review of it where the main cast of characters almost has like a one-to-one comparison to the main cast of Star Wars A New Hope. Your Luke Skywalker, your Han Solo, Chewbacca, Princess Leia. A lot of Final Fantasy XII story really boils down to a princess is captured and you and a cast of characters needs to go save her. So, I don't think the story is anything to write home about either. I did enjoy it. The game in its entirety took me about 50 to 60 hours to beat, and I thoroughly enjoyed the entirety of my time playing it. But if you want to hear more about why I liked Final Fantasy XII, the soundtrack, the differences between the original game and the remaster and Zodiac Age, and all the quality of life improvements that come along with it, definitely go and check out my review. We are now getting into my top 5 games of the year, and coming in at number 5 is a sequel to one of my favorite games on the PlayStation 4, that is Spider-Man 2. This is really the culmination of everything that happened in that first game and the events of Miles Morales, and man, it takes like an hour or two to kind of get going, but once it does, if you just focus on the main story quest events like I did, it really does not allow you to catch your breath. Again, without going into any spoilers, I loved their take on Venom and how they introduced that character into the story. It's unlike anything I've ever seen in comics or the Spider-Man movies, and so I think you're really in for a treat if you've never played, or if you've yet to play the game and you're a fan of the Spider-Man character. But what can be said about this game that probably you haven't already read on the internet? I mean, navigating this world is as fun as it's ever been. Whether you're playing as Miles or Peter, I think each one has kind of their unique combat mechanics that make each character fresh, distinct, and kind of unique. They also added a wingsuit in this game, so getting from one end of the city is just such a blast. I don't think I've ever used the fast travel mechanic in certainly the first Spider-Man. I definitely didn't use it at all in the second one. So everything kind of comes to a crazy bombastic finish in this one, and there's a rather interesting post-credit scene that sets up the events of Spider-Man 3 really well. So very much looking forward to that and anything Insomniac does next. And the other thing I'll say is that I actually did not get the Platinum Trophy in this one, so I definitely have to go back and do some cleanup. Like I said at the top, I really just focus on the main story because there were so many other games that I wanted to get to in the fall when Spider-Man 2 released. But if you haven't played it yet, you're certainly in for a treat. And if you haven't played Spider-Man 1 or Miles Morales, I'd highly encourage you to do that because they are also some of my favorites on the PlayStation 4. Now, this is where things get a little interesting because I already shared my top 10 games of the year on my podcast, Otaku Brothers. I'll put a link to that in the description below if you want to hear my brother-in-law and I just gush about our top 10 games in a much longer forum. I've had a few more weeks to think about my top 10, and maybe I'm going against the rules a little bit, but it's my list. I'm going to do what I want to. I did end up changing the order just slightly for these top 4 games, and I have to imagine that by the end of 2024, I might look back on this top 10 and even think about changing up the order even more. But the more time I've had to reflect, the more I really like this order over the order of my podcast. So originally, my number 4 was Final Fantasy 16. Now, that game at number 4 is Alan Wake 2, a game that was 13 years in the making, a sequel to what many consider to be a cult classic on the Xbox 360, a game I played at or near launch on the 360. I think I many years ago even unboxed the collector's edition here on YouTube. If you have any interest in checking that out in all of its 240p glory.
Hey guys, it's Rusty. Today I'm going to be unboxing the limited collector's edition for Alan Wake, the exclusive title released earlier this year on the Xbox 360.
Now, candidly, when this game came out, I was not planning to buy it day one. So much so that I installed Alan Wake Remastered the days leading up to its release and its review embargo, and I was planning to play that in anticipation of playing the second game because it's been 13 years since I've played the original and I felt like I needed a refresher. But once the reviews came out for Alan Wake 2 and they were just glowing across the board, I thought, maybe I'm just going to watch like a little 5-minute YouTube recap, kind of summarizing the story and then just jump in Alan Wake 2, which is exactly what I did. I still want to go back and play the remastered version of Alan Wake, but for the sake of this conversation, let's just focus on Alan Wake 2 and how bizarre, strange, just fascinating a game this is. It is just such a unique survival horror experience with this kind of dual narrative campaign that continues the events of the first game. You're playing as both Alan Wake and this woman named Saga Anderson. It just so consistently blended these like very slow burn story exposition moments with actually insane psychological horror sequences that really reminded me of art house horror films like Hereditary or Midsommar, if you've seen anything like that. And without spoiling anything, you've probably seen it in some capacity to this point if you are on YouTube or you watch the Game Awards, but the full motion video sequences in this game are just absolutely outstanding, and how they blend that with the in-game mechanics is unlike anything I've ever seen in a game before. And in addition to the full motion video sequences, you can't talk about Alan Wake 2 without also highlighting the music in this game. Now, to my recollection, at the end of Alan Wake 1, or at the end of each chapter in Alan Wake 1, it was very TV show-like where as you go into that next chapter, it would say previously on Alan Wake, and it would kind of have a quick summary of the events in the previous chapter. Things are a little bit different in Alan Wake 2, where at the end of each chapter, a song plays. And those songs that I think were made specifically for this game just perfectly kind of capture thematically and even lyrically what took place over the course of the previous chapter and kind of kicks things off leading into the next. It was so freaking good, and I always looked forward to finishing a chapter and in anticipation of the song that was going to play that, again, really kind of captured the events of the chapter that you just went through. Now, from a gameplay side of things, it's also worth calling out that I still feel like Remedy hasn't really found a good balance between the shooting mechanics, which are kind of cruddy. They're not very good in this game. They weren't really great in the first game, and I feel like they put too much of an emphasis on flashing your flashlight on an enemy, shooting them, and then moving on to the next dozen people that you have to kill. There's still quite a bit of that in Alan Wake 2, and in the moments where it kind of reminds you you're playing a video game, I kind of was just telling myself, like, Remedy, stop it. Just get back to the very atmospheric, crime-solving, investigation-type stuff, just exploring these really dark, weird, strange environments, picking up notes, picking up clues, and just really trying to piece together what's going on in this very strange world. Like, that's where Alan Wake 2 is at its best. I don't like it when they kind of pull you out of that and say, hey, here's an entire hallway full of guys that you have to kill, and then in addition to that, when you kind of retreat to this cabin playing as Saga Anderson, there's even ways to kind of upgrade your character, and it's like, this stuff is so minimal and really doesn't do much to further the game in any meaningful way. Just get me back to the exploration and crime-solving mechanics of the game. That's where Alan Wake 2 truly shines, regardless of whether you're playing as Alan Wake or Saga Anderson. And the last thing I'll say about Alan Wake 2 is just that playing it really felt like when I played Resident Evil 7 for the first time. Not because Alan Wake 2 is really ever as scary as RE7 was, but it really felt like I was playing something so uncharacteristic of what came before. It felt like it was really breathing or breaking new ground in reinventing survival horror in a way that I hadn't seen before. And I have to imagine that going forward, there's going to be some developer that creates some horror game that borrows inspiration or was inspired by the things that Alan Wake 2 does, because it works so incredibly well Remedy does not seem to miss, and I feel like I owe it to the developer to go back and play things like Quantum Break and Control, because without spoiling anything, all of these universes all culminate into one actual world in one way or another, and it's just truly fascinating stuff. So Alan Wake 2, an amazing game, very much enjoyed it, but there were a couple other games, the more I thought about them, I think the further they needed to be on my list. Now, coming in at number 3, this game used to be number 4 if you're going by my podcast top 10, and that is Final Fantasy 16. This was my most anticipated game coming into the year, and it did not disappoint. I had rolled credits in about 70 hours, and my goodness, what a freaking ride 16 was. I very much enjoyed its kind of darker approach to storytelling. I'm actually replaying Final Fantasy 15 now, and just exploring that beautiful open world that's very vibrant and colorful. 4 bros on a road trip, just having a good old time. That is not Final Fantasy 16. It is dark, it is gray, it is very Game of Thrones inspired. It wears its inspiration on its sleeve, and it deals with some very heavy themes, all of which I enjoyed so much. The combat, you have to bring it up. This is an action game. This is not an RPG. Yes, you can get equipment and level it up and things like that, but for the most part, this is Devil May Cry meets Final Fantasy, and for the most part, I really enjoyed that. I do wish there was a bit more nuance to the combat, more strategy involved, because, you know, playing something like Final Fantasy 12 earlier in the year, or Final Fantasy 13 with its paradigm system, there's a lot of strategy that goes into that. It's very nuanced and complex, and in 16, for the most part, when you unlock these new abilities, it's just kind of mashing the X button and, you know, killing waves upon waves of enemies, getting from A to B. That's really it. And you know what? That's okay. I really enjoyed it, but once I was kind of hitting that 50, 40 hour mark, I was like, yeah, I do wish there was maybe a little bit more nuance to the combat, but its story and its cast of characters are so strong, as is its soundtrack by Masayoshi Soken, who composed the soundtrack for Final Fantasy XIV, the MMO. I mean, he really just did such a tremendous job complementing these really dark, heavy scenes that are just dramatic and, I mean, at times sad and epic. I mean, just my goodness. But you also cannot talk about Final Fantasy XVI without discussing the boss battles, which are just absurd. Just the spectacle, how they continue to outdo each boss battle with, again, just the pure absurdity of it all. These are not just, 5 to 8, 10-minute boss battles. These are 30, 40, 50 minutes long, some of these boss battles. It is insane, but clearly the developers had a vision for this game. I think they executed on that very well. I have my gripes, I have my complaints, the boring side quests that really don't get interesting until the final hours of the game. Maybe the combat could have been a bit more nuanced, but I think the things that I really enjoyed, the story, the characters, the music, the world building, all of that shines so much brighter than my complaints, and that's why it's my number 3 game of the year. I still need to play the first round of DLC. I think there's another, round of DLC coming later in the spring. So very much looking forward to going back to this game and maybe someday playing through it again on New Game Plus to earn those last few trophies to get the platinum. Now, coming in at number 2, this honestly could be my game of the year if I continue to think about it, but we're locking it in at 2. It was the biggest surprise of the year for me, and that is Starfield. This is a game I knew I wanted to get on the ground floor and play day one, just to kind of be a part of that conversation. A game like Skyrim, Breath of the Wild, Starfield, like these types of games really only come out like once a console generation for the most part. And so I wanted to be a part of that initial buzz. And I played it for about 5 hours initially and was just overwhelmed, to be honest with you, because there are just so many systems. If you watched that walkthrough of the game over the summer with Todd Howard and the Bethesda team, there was base building, there was ship building, there was mining and crafting for parts, exploring these hundreds of planets that you can find, the faction quest lines, not to mention the main quest in Starfield. And they don't waste any time introducing you to a lot of this stuff at the very forefront of the game. And again, it can just be overwhelming. So I shelved it. I played some other games, and then I did a podcast with a buddy of mine, and I was picking his brain about it because it was one of his most anticipated games coming into the year. And based on just the praise that he showered upon this game, I felt like I owed it to myself to go back and give it a try, especially since it was free on Game Pass. And then over the course of the next several weeks, I put another 70 to 80 hours in Starfield. I completed the main quest, all 4 main faction quest lines. It got to the point where I was just taking my ship out into the deep outskirts of the galaxy, landing on random planets, just so I could see the random alien life that lived there. And it got to the point too where I was kind of building this catalog of photographs, almost like in a Pokedex-like fashion, of all the different random alien life and creatures that I discovered on these different planets that I was landing on. But I want to take a step back because this is probably the game I'm going to talk about the most over the course of this top 10 video. Starfield has a lot of problems, and this is probably the best example of, one, a game that your mileage may vary. I feel like the more you play Starfield, the more you invest in it, the more the game rewards you for doing so, the more time you spend and get kind of deep into its mechanics. But this is also the best example of a game that's probably a 7 out of 10, from an objective review score standpoint. All reviews are subjective, I get that. But then beyond that, it's probably also the best example of a 9.5 out of 10 game experience for me, because I just got so lost in this world, its characters, kind of this space fantasy role-playing experience. But where things really changed for me with Starfield is one of the main protagonists in it. Her name's Sarah. She works at Constellation. She's the person who's kind of delivering a lot of these main quests to you in your main hub area. And it got to a point where I kind of wanted to really lean into this role-playing experience. And so there's a handful of characters in Starfield that you can romance in a similar fashion to the Mass Effect, Dragon Age, BioWare type games. And so I was talking Sarah up when I was, getting the next main quests, and it got to a point where I would exhaust all dialogue options and I could begin to flirt with her. And at one point I began to flirt with her, and I asked her the types of things that she likes to do outside of work. And when she basically shared with me that back in the day before she joined Constellation, she was a drummer in a punk rock band, I was like, oh hell yeah. We're going to continue to exhaust all these dialogue options, make sure that every decision I make, everything I say is in a positive, or is going to benefit me in a positive way as it relates to my relationship with Sarah. And it got to a point where I had fully romanced her. We got married, and she was my permanent companion in this game. And so we finished the final main quest lines together, or the final main quests, and then I proceeded to go through all of the 4 main faction quest lines. So if you've played stuff like Oblivion in Skyrim, think the Dark Brotherhood, the Thieves Guild, the Mages Guild, those types of quest lines, but in Starfield. And the reason why I became so immersed in this experience is because this person was my wife in the game. And every decision I made then, every dialogue option or every interaction I had with an NPC, I had Sarah at the forefront of my mind, because I didn't want anything I said or did in the game to impact my relationship with this person. Because if you killed random people, she was going to call you on it and say, what are you doing? This isn't us. This isn't me. I don't agree with the things you're doing. And so because of that, I put an additional 40, 50 hours with just this person, wandering the galaxy with her, going through all of these quests. And I think it was because of that this game is so high on my list, because when I play RPGs, whether it's Skyrim, it's Mass Effect, Fallout, I really don't tend to embody that role-playing experience and kind of escape to this other universe and pretend I'm this person. I love the sense of escapism that comes with those types of games, but I don't really tend to embody that character in a way as if I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons. But with Starfield, once I got to know Sarah, I really felt like almost an obligation to play the game through that lens, or looking through that lens, and it just dramatically changed my approach to playing the game. And that, and a number of other reasons, is why Starfield is so high on my list. I also just think it's a freaking ton of fun to play. I don't really enjoy the Fallout games, or to this point, I really haven't. I just feel like the shooting mechanics can be very clunky and just prohibitive to really enjoying the experience. It really takes me out of it. But I felt like the gunplay in Starfield was so tight and so strong, and just the general sound design is just terrific. Like, I just feel like the guns just feel so good in your hands. The feedback of the guns, the sound effects is just all so well done, and Bethesda clearly went out of their way to really polish this game up from a first-person shooter perspective. And just speaking of sound design, like, every time you pick up an item in this game, it has a unique sound effect. So when you pick up a med pack, it has the same sound effect as when you actually apply that med pack to yourself. If you're exploring the world and you enjoy picking up random objects like notebooks and mugs and things of that nature, all of those have a unique sound effect as well. So if you find a random wooden duck statue, it makes a quack noise when you pick it up. And I just feel like that attention to detail is not something that was really highlighted in reviews. I saw a lot of people, whether it was the IGNs or other people on the internet, just really criticizing this game for a lot of things. And a lot of that criticism was warranted. But I feel like that attention to detail, its phenomenal soundtrack that really is Hans Zimmer-like when you think of something like Interstellar, it just complements the experience of getting lost in this space opera fantasy adventure so well. And I'm gonna pause there. I really feel like I probably need to do just a longer kind of retrospective review of Starfield and really highlight end to end the things I liked, the things I didn't like, and why this was such a special experience for me in 2023. And also why I can't wait to go back into that game, start a new Game Plus file, play the heck out of the DLC whenever it releases. Starfield is incredibly special. Again, your mileage may vary. It's not going to be for everyone, and it really is going to take quite a bit of patience to understand its finer mechanics. But if you give it the time of day, I really think it rewards you for doing so, and that's why it's one of my favorite games of 2023. Last but certainly not least, my game of the year, a game that I was anticipating. I wanted to play it, but I really didn't know how well it was going to turn out. So it really wasn't meant to be a day one purchase for me, but I'm a huge fan of where kind of this story borrows its inspiration, if you will. And my game of the year is none other than Lord of the Rings Gollum. I am kidding, of course. Gollum is one of the worst games I have ever played in my life. My true game of the year is none other than Lies of P, a Souls-like game that looks very much like Bloodborne, plays quite a bit like Bloodborne, but it is not that game. It is very much its own unique experience that, yeah, it's the Pinocchio game. You play as Pinocchio, your father's Geppetto, you update your P organ. There's a whole bunch of weird lore and story related things that I will not be getting into, but what I will say is that I was completely blown away how invested I was in the story of this game, and it has one of the craziest, mind-blowing post-game cutscenes I've ever seen. It is probably the craziest post-game cutscene I've ever seen in my life. It's absolutely wild. I cannot wait to see what this team does with the DLC, and certainly with its sequel and in the direction it's going. You thought Pinocchio was crazy? Wait until you see the sequel for Lies of P. It's truly amazing stuff. But what I loved most about this game is that I have an interesting history with the FromSoft games. So Dark Souls 1 through 3, Demon Souls, Elden Ring, all of those types of games I tend to play alongside my brother-in-law because he is a super fan of the FromSoft games. He also knows exactly how to basically break those games, get a tremendous amount of souls, become overpowered in the early game. And so I kind of always look to him to kind of guide me through these experiences. But I knew he wasn't going to play the game day one. I knew it was going to release on Game Pass day one. So I figured I'm going to give this game a try and see if I can play through it on my own without his help. And what I discovered is that I'm capable of playing these games without someone holding my hand. And that's not to say that Lies of P is really any easier than a lot of the other Dark Souls games, but I think there are some, I don't know if you want to call them quality of life updates or how it streamlines some of the mechanics of those FromSoft games that came before it, but it is rather linear. It's pretty A to B in its level design, and so that you don't really get lost. And beyond that, it's not overly cryptic with how it's telling its story. Dark Souls, you have to talk to these random people that are off the beaten path, that if you don't talk to a particular person, you don't initiate their quest, and then you miss out on their quest line earlier, and maybe you miss out on a really cool armor set. But again, the game never tells you explicitly that you need to do these things, and it can just be very convoluted and just frustrating, to be honest with you. And Lies of P doesn't do a lot of those things. It actually is pretty straightforward. The story is weird, goofy, strange, and dark, but I really loved its interpretation of Pinocchio for what it's worth. But where Lies of P really shines is its combat, and it's kind of forces you or encourages you to experiment with all of these different weapons that you can kind of mix and match. And by the end of the game, I was kind of balancing between a katana and a giant pipe wrench. So if that gives you any kind of indication of the types of things that you can use in the game to your advantage, there's a ton of weapons, again, to experiment with. And beyond that, I just always looked forward to getting to the end of a chapter, fighting a boss, and then getting introduced to that next chapter area, because I feel like the level design in this over the course of its, I think, 11 to 13 chapters, every area that you go to and all the different environments kind of have that very gothic aesthetic similar to Bloodborne, but they're very distinct, they're unique, they're different, and each environment feels so fun and interesting to explore because you just never really know what's around the corner. I feel like the enemy design is also very distinct and unique over the course of the game. They're not rinse and repeating the different enemies that you kind of come into contact with. And in very Souls-like fashion, the bosses are punishing. A lot of them are really, really tough. I mean, there were some bosses that probably took me 20 to 30 attempts, if not more, to beat some of these guys. But in Dark Souls-like fashion, the sense of satisfaction when you kind of overcome and persevere with these very difficult bosses is almost second to none compared to other games. And just that sense of accomplishment when you finally overcome and defeat one of those very challenging bosses that had just been kicking your butt for an hour or more. I don't know if this is the best place to start for anyone looking to get into the Dark Souls-like games. I would say Lies of P, Bloodborne, or Dark Souls 3 are probably your best place to start because they're fast, the combat's very fluid, it doesn't feel stiff and clunky and slow like some of the earlier Dark Souls 1, 2, Demon Souls. But Lies of P, again, it's my game of the year for a number of reasons, but I think more than anything, it reminded me why I love the FromSoft titles so much. The sense of satisfaction when you finally overcome and defeat a boss, and then just, again, experimenting with its variety of weapons over the course of the game was just such a blast. So it's on Game Pass. I'd highly recommend people give it a try if you like Dark Souls. But again, it's not for the faint of heart. This game is very, very tough. And with that being said, that is my list. Those are my top 10 games of the year. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you come away from this video with a recommendation or two. Definitely let me know in the comments, what were some of your favorite games in 2023? Also, what do you think about my list? Are there any games that maybe I did inspire you to hopefully play going forward? I really appreciate everyone watching, and I will see you in the next video.